So many recording options. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him, his pronouns. I help to run along with David Kide, the Metro DC DSA Socialist Night School. Thank you to everyone who's joining us tonight. We are extremely honored this evening because we are joined by Sean Good. Sean is a senior editor at Jacobin. He's edited a number of my pieces, so if you didn't like them, you could probably direct your ire at him tonight. He is also currently writing a book on Eugene Debs, and he also runs the Debs Dispatch, a Substack about all things Eugene Debs. Sean, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be with you. I feel like very comfortable having this conversation with you, Chip, because we've worked together for several years now at this point.
I believe you've edited a piece of mine about Debs, so
That's true. That is
yeah.
true. Yeah.
Maybe two.
You've written so many that I forgot about that piece.
I think one your colleague edited and one you edited. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's start with the question in a few sentences. If there's an audience member, these are geared towards people assuming no prior knowledge of the topic. If you had to, in 3 or 4 sentences, explain to someone who was Eugene Debs, how would you do it?
I would say he was the most prominent socialist, American socialist of his time. He was born in 1855, died in 1926. He was, one of the most important labor leaders of the late 1800s, and then became one of the most prominent, and certainly one of the most important American socialists in the early 20th century.
So we're going to talk about his career as a socialist politician, but
Mm-hmm.
what was Debs's early political trajectory like?
Well, it's interesting because in writing the book, I'm sort of going back to some of his early life, and this shows up in every biography, every competent biography that's been written about him. So it's nothing new, but it is really striking how moderate, even conservative, he was as a young trade union leader. So, like I said, he was born in 1855 in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was a Midwesterner really his whole life. He lived in Terre Haute his whole life, and that's in the western part of the state. It's maybe an hour and a half from Indianapolis, and he, he's in this sort of small but growing town, and he's born to French immigrant parents. Relatively, he wasn't poor, he wasn't rich. I mean, a pretty like his parents were fairly successful grocers, so he kind of grew up lower middle to middle class. And then when he was 15 or 14, sorry, he went to work on the railroad for the first time. And there are mixed accounts about why he actually went to work on the railroad. I think it's probably fair to say that he was helping, he was both motivated by economic concerns. Like, it certainly helped his family to have some extra money coming in, but it was also like the sense of adventure too. But it was like the first, period where he's joining the sort of ranks of the growing working class at the time. Yeah.
And during this period in his life, does he hold elected office at some point, or did I?
Yeah. So that's coming up.
Okay.
So he first wins elected office. He's a city clerk for Terre Haute, and then later he's a state legislator from Indiana, and that's in the 1800s. A city clerk in the late 1870s, and then a legislator. He only served one term in like the mid 1880s, and through both of those periods in office, he's like I said, he's a very moderate, even sometimes conservative figure. Certainly pro-worker, but kind of a mild reformer. And when he gets involved in union politics, he's definitely on the side of the union movement that is preaching moderation, opposing strikes, trying to sort of lift up the um, the kind of moral values really of the worker, and sort of prove to employers that they're worthy of employment, really. And that's the, once you sort of prove that you can be a kind of esteemed worker, then the employer will sort of, by the grace of God, will help you out, and will give you the kind of wages that you deserve. So that's the view that Debs held at the time.
So is that what you're referring to when you reference his conservatism?
Yeah,
Conservative.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So one area where Debs isn't conservative during this time period is in relationship to the suffragist movement. Could you expound a little bit on Debs's relationship to the suffragist movement?
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't. I wouldn't say he was. He wasn't involved per se in the suffragette movement or anything, but it is really striking. Like, even when he was quite a young man, he supported suffrage for women, and even brought Susan B. Anthony to Terre Haute in 1880, when it was, the position itself of giving women the vote was quite controversial, and also Susan B. Anthony herself was quite controversial. And Debs, this was even before Debs had. You can sort of pinpoint Debs's starting. Debs starts to move left in other stuff in the mid 1880s, but this was even before that. So it is kind of an interesting anomaly, that he supported giving women the right to vote so early, and was pretty unabashed about it. The other people in this lecture society that he had helped found in Terre Haute didn't support bringing Susan B. Anthony to town, and he basically, if I remember right, he basically went outside the lecture society, and just kind of brought her personally, like sponsored her to come personally, and not many people showed up to the event. And but yeah, it's both an interesting, like I said, an interesting anomaly, and then also, you could tell a story where it's like, um, I, you could tell a story where it's like one of the early instances of like Debs kind of staking out this courageous stand, and he would become much more well known for those later in his life.
So I think at this point we should discuss the Pullman strike.
Okay.
First, could you explain to us what the Pullman strike was, what its significance, and what was Deb's role in it? Did he support going on strike? And then once the strike was underway, how did he interact with it?
Yeah, so the Pullman strike was a really important labor conflict. It was, one of the most important strikes of the last, 3 decades of the 20th century. When, as I said before, the kind of industrial working class in the United States was really swelling. When capitalism was, expanding, and the U.S. was kind of moving away from its agrarian past. This is the kind of climate that Debs grew up in and really forged his politics. So the Pullman strike was really central to that, both industrializing America and the kind of labor capital conflicts that came about, and also to Debs personally. So at this point, Debs is almost 40 years old. It was in 1894, so he's not a young man, but he's at that point he's sort of he's certainly jettisoned the more conservative elements of his politics, but he's not a socialist yet. He hasn't publicly declared himself a socialist. He wouldn't do that for a few more years. But he, in 1893, 1 year before the Pullman strike, he helps found the American Railway Union, which is an industrial union. In other words, it's a union that takes in everyone in a given industry or a given sector, regardless of skill level or um, um, craft. So it's against the kind of prevailing more conservative craft unionism. And so, switchmen and brakemen and conductors and engineers and all of them, and even the people that work in more office jobs, for the railroads, the various railroads in the country, they're all going to be brought under this one union. That's the idea. So you have kind of strength and unity. You break down the divisions between these different crafts. And before then, there were different orders, they called them, or unions of various railroad workers. So there was a locomotive engineers, there was a fireman. This is what Debs was in. He was a fireman.
Well-timed train.
What's that?
It's a well-timed train.
Yes.
It knows you're talking. It's giving you a little color to your presentation.
Yes. So Debs was a fireman by trade, and so they had a union. The switchman had a union. The brakeman had a union. All of them are in these different unions, and so that poses obvious problems for a kind of more solidaristic form of collective action, I guess you could say. And so the American Railway Union forms up according to this idea. Debs is at the helm, and then the following year is the Pullman strike. So this was a strike of, and originally it was a strike of the workers that built sleeping cars for George Pullman's company. This was a company town just south of Chicago. And it's interesting because I went there actually a few months ago, and it's still sort of obviously it's quite different in some ways, but the architecture, you can still see the kind of remnants of the company town in the kind of model city that it was, model town that it was supposed to be. I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't. I'll stick to the Pullman strike itself. So they're in this community just south of Chicago. They have grievances, both wage grievances, but also the fact that it's a company town too, and the extent to which George Pullman, the leader of the company, exercises so much control over their daily lives. So it's like a fiefdom, and it's not just a fiefdom at the workplace. It's a fiefdom in their daily lives. So they go on strike, and they sort of appeal to the American Railway Union. They're not organized. They're not most of them aren't members, but they sort of appeal to the American Railway Union. They're like, this is the kind of struggle that you need to get behind. This is what we're, this is the kind of battle that you're trying to wage. So at the same time, it's also spreading too, and it's spreading across the railroad, not just the Midwest, but around the country. And so it becomes a massive strike, not just the local kind of Chicago strike involving Pullman workers, but railroad workers all over the country. And Debs is the leader of the union. He is, to your question, he's still a little skittish about strikes, but it's more because he sort of has this idea at the time that if you're really well organized, then you don't really have to go out on strike, because you can really meet, you can sort of show with the might of your organization that the employer sort of needs to concede to your demands, or at least needs to meet you on a level playing field. So he is a little, and also the American Railway Union is still quite young too. So he's sort of afraid, and others are afraid that they're going to imperil the organization from a kind of it's still in a sort of gestation phase, and it could threaten that. But after they vote to support the union, he's all on board, and he's going all over and sending telegrams and kind of giving people information about what's going on, and kind of trying to rally support from other unions. And for this, him and some of the leaders of the ARU are jailed during the Pullman strike.
Let's talk about the degree of federal repression
Yeah.
during the Pullman strike. My understanding, and if I'm wrong, I know you will correct me, Sean. Uh, the federal government actually attaches to the Pullman car mail cars, correct, to sort of justify a federal intervention.
Yeah, in the I mean the workers are very, these are not obtuse workers. They know exactly like what kind of justification the federal government's going to use. So they explicitly like they unlink cars and they're like, okay, you can continue, you can take the passengers, you can take the mail trains, and you can go, but we're not going to handle the Pullman cars. And then the companies, yeah, exactly. They would link it to the mail cars and be like, this is a problem with, you're threatening the delivery of the mail, and so we can step in and we can issue injunctions, and we can issue injunctions and then throw you in jail if you violate the injunctions.
So the federal government becomes involved then.
Yes.
And is there violence against the workers?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, there's I would say there's probably, I mean, it's not the kind of violence you hear in some kind of labor battles of like, you know, company thugs like mowing workers down with machine guns and stuff like that. It didn't reach that level of violence, but certainly, yeah, there was brutal repression of the strike, and then both jailing of leaders and workers too.
So explain what the injunction was and how it leads to Eugene Debs being in jail for the first time, but not the last time.
Yeah, for the first time, not the last time. Yeah.
I mean, we'll get to jail number 2 later on.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the injunction was becoming like one of the kind of primary means by which the federal government would repress strikes. And so essentially, yeah, they would, often it was at the behest of the company. A company would be like, they're messing with our commerce. and then the federal government would step in, a friendly judge would step in and would issue an injunction, which was, a legal order basically saying you can't participate in this type of labor action. If you do, we're going to throw you in jail. And it was interesting because, and Debs commented on this at the time and kind of furiously objected to it. They called it like government by injunction. And part of this was the basic due process rights were just thrown out the window. Like you didn't, if you were thrown in jail for an injunction, there wasn't some sort of legal process by which you could exculpate yourself. It was just you violated this injunction that this judge just kind of summarily handed down, and that's the law. So it was an incredibly effective tactic, because it was so quick, I guess. I mean, it was just a ready means of using the power of the state to step in on behalf of private capital.
So to summarize Debs' trajectory here, early on, he's not in favor of going on strike, but when the strike vote is called, he becomes an enthusiastic supporter of it. And when the government tries to stop him from continuing his activities with the injunction, he defies the government. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
And he is represented, I believe, by Clarence Darrow, who quits his job as a railroad corporation attorney and then becomes most famed criminal defense attorney of the early 20th century. But that will have to be a different night school. So Debs is in jail. How does this impact his worldview?
Yeah, so this is a really pivotal moment in Debs's life. Again, it's a little hazy because Debs tells a particular story about how he became a socialist, and other kind of different biographical accounts have said different things about when exactly Debs became a socialist. And it's hard to say. On some level, it doesn't really matter that much. Again, like I said, he publicly declares himself a socialist on January 1st, 1897. but it's like very it's very clear that the Pullman strike had this incredibly radicalizing effect on him. And that was, if you could pinpoint an event, that's what made him a socialist.
And representatives of the socialist movement, I believe, come and visit him, and I
Yeah,
believe Victor Berger gives him
yeah,
a copy of Capital, which I
yeah,
don't know if
yeah.
he read or not. I think it's been a while since I've looked at Debs's biography, but Berger gives him a copy of Capital while he's in prison.
Yeah, he read Capital, or at least he was given Capital. He read The Class Struggle by Karl Kautsky, the German
Oh,
Marxist. He read The Cooperative Commonwealth, I believe, by Lawrence Grunland, which was formative. I think he read that in prison. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so he has a lot of guests. Actually, Keir Hardie visits him when he's in prison too. The Scottish socialist and uh, co-founder or founder of the Labour Party in the UK. So he is like around, he's being exposed to these different ideas, we can say, and I think his experience with the kind of way that the power of the federal government is used on behalf of private capital to sort of discipline workers and repress any sort of challenges they make to the kind of despotic workplaces that the workers are kind of toiling in. This is a very kind of eye-opening event. He has this one line. Let me pull it up because it kind of summarizes it well, about his transition to socialism. He says, "I was to be baptized in socialism in the roar of conflict, and the gleam of every bayonet and the flash of every rifle. The class struggle was revealed." So that's a nice little kind of summation of what kind of pushed Debs to the
political
left.
repression oftentimes has sort of a
Yeah.
counterproductive effect than is intended. It ends up radicalizing
Mm.
people. Sometimes, not always. Sometimes it works, but I know with Debs and other figures who start off on more moderate paths, the repression of the government ends up what being finally radicalizes them.
No, that's a
So
very good point. Yeah.
when Debs joins the socialist movement, you said it was June of 1897. What does this movement look like in this country?
It certainly wasn't a mass movement. It wasn't a particularly sizable movement of any sort. There had been socialists around. The early socialists in the US were mostly German immigrants, and they were important in the International Working Men's Party, which played like a really important role in the St. Louis General Strike in 1877. And they were around for some years after that. The Socialist Labor Party was, I think it's actually still exists, but it was, yeah. But Daniel De Leon was the kind of chief theoretician, and they were more Marxist. De Leon was like a very kind of orthodox sectarian type, and so
Lenin criticizes him. That is how high his profile was at the time. That he earns a rebuke from all the way in Soviet Russia at one point.
Yeah. So both of those parties are existing at certain points, but yeah, there's not a whole lot. There's also this tradition of utopian socialism to some extent in the U.S. too, of like elsewhere, of the kind of socialism that Marx criticized, of trying to build kind of intentional communities and sort of create socialism in these kind of small, far-flung communities. So that was going on too. But yeah, there wasn't a whole lot, to be honest. But then you also have the kind of rising workers movement. So, which is not certainly not in its majority, or there. It's the degree of socialist influence in the workers' movement at the time is like infinitesimal. So yeah, there's not a whole lot going on, but there is. You can like look abroad and see like these rising parties, especially in Germany, and rising kind of socialist parties. And so there is, it's both like a somewhat barren landscape, but also there's, kind of green shoots, I guess you could say.
So when does the Socialist Party that Debs is most associated with, when does that actually form?
It's formed in 1901, and it's out of a part of the Socialist Labor Party and the Social Democratic Party um, in the U.S. So they combined to form the Socialist Party. Um, yeah. So he actually runs on the Social Democratic Party line in 1900. That's the first time he runs for president.
And the first time with the Socialist Party is 1904.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, so once the Socialist Party is established, though, what do they look like? What are some of their successes, some of their limitations? I know that's a broad question, and that covers um, arguably several decades. But just give us a sense of who this party was.
Well, I guess maybe it'd be easiest to talk about it in its somewhat more mature form, because obviously it grows pretty rapidly. Um, and by say like 1912, it's if not a mass party, it's certainly on the cusp of being a mass party. I mean, it has support in large swaths of the country, really, outside of say like the Deep South, maybe. Although it does have support in certainly in Texas and Louisiana, in Oklahoma, those portions, but not say like Mississippi or Alabama. But anyway, so yeah, it's this very broad ecumenical party, really. It has more conservative elements that are closer to the American Federation of Labor. Victor Berger is the kind of one that personifies this. These are the so-called sewer socialists who in Milwaukee, build up kind of public works programs and have really strong ties to organized labor.
And the
Electorally,
sewer socialists are in power in those municipalities, right? That's a term
yeah.
for. I don't think everyone necessarily realizes this, but like socialist parties governed some local municipalities.
Oh, a ton. Yeah. I
Yes,
mean,
yes.
a lot. Milwaukee was the biggest, but I mean, socialists, yeah, they had obviously a varying degrees of power, but yeah, I mean, they had enormous, especially in kind of mid-sized like railway towns, stuff like that. Like, they would, elect mayors and many city council members. And so they had the sewer socialists. You had out in the West, you had the more kind of radical unionism that was embodied in the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And you had that was a kind of more militant kind of class struggle unionism and socialism, but it was also more it was opposed to more electoral efforts, but it was also it it also tended to encompass broader parts of the working class. So, the IWW would organize Black workers and women, and something that the right of the party was quite bad on, really. And then there was like, Jewish garment workers in New York formed a really important part of their base. And then they had, timber workers in Louisiana. They had tenant farmers in Oklahoma. So yeah, it was a big ecumenical party with both kind of tenant farmers, and various portions of, and farmers too, not just tenant farmers, small farmers, and then various types of workers, and then some middle class professionals too, like lawyers. And but it was, yeah, like I said, it was a big party in 1912. Debs ran and got over 1 million votes, and that was the kind of peak at the point, and it ended up being the most votes he got, the most votes that the Socialist Party got percentage wise. But you know, they expected to keep going up and up and up.
Yeah. And what's Deb's role in all of this as this is happening?
So he was mostly a spokesperson and kind of a master orator. He wasn't really. He certainly had like strong, positions, and he was on the left of the party. Uh, so when it came to industrial unionism versus like more of an AFL position, he was for industrial unionism. He was not for the craft unionism of the AFL. And when it came to electoral politics, he was more inclined to say that this is like a propaganda tool, that we need to use elections to educate workers about the kind of injustices of capitalism, and sort of use this to build the class struggle, as opposed to more of a kind of reformist position that the sewer socialists took. But he also, he wasn't, he was able to speak for, like, he had so much rank and file support that he was able to speak to like different poles of the party, and was able to, he was like even though he was on the left of the party, he was like kind of coalescing force really. And so he ran for president. He would have run in 1906, or sorry, 1916, if his health permitted, but he ran every 4 years, with the exception of 1916, he ran every 4 years from 1900 to 1920.
And we'll get to the 1920 election
Yeah.
in a little bit, since that is a special circumstance, if you will.
Yeah.
So how does Eugene Debs, what does socialism mean to Debs? How would he have described his vision of socialism?
So, I mean, you could talk about it in a number of ways, but, and I'm perhaps showing my own politics to some extent on this, but I think like one of the best ways to think about Debs is this question of democracy. And Debs found capitalism revolting because of the way that it pushed workers into dependence on their bosses, and this kind of tyrannical relationship that workers had vis-a-vis their bosses, and also the ways that that capitalists were able to control the political sphere too. So in both in the economic and political sphere, Debs was like, there are these democratic values that I hold dear, and America says it believes in, but the only way that we're actually going to achieve those ideals is if workers can unite at the ballot box and in the workplace, and kind of throw off the kind of master class in both those spheres.
I mean, phrases that Debs frequently evoked to sort of explain his vision of socialism were either industrial democracy or
Yeah.
the cooperative commonwealth.
Yeah.
Could you explain a little bit what's meant by those terms?
Yeah. Well, I mean, industrial democracy basically means extending democracy to the economic sphere. As I said before, Debs's life it kind of, I mean, it covers the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, and so he's really politicized in the Gilded Age especially, and sees this through his organizing, and to some extent through the work he does in the railroad as well, but even more through his organizing, just going to different railroad towns and coal towns, and just talking to workers. And he sees the ways that workers, their livelihood is dependent on the whims of their bosses and capitalists. And he he thinks this is unjust, and that you can't have um, a kind of free society if these are if this is the basis of your economic system. You need different organizing principle. And so industrial democracy would be the way that he would put it, kind of in the economic sphere. And then the cooperative commonwealth obviously is a little broader. It is like this idea that, like, instead of competing with each other in this kind of dog eat dog world, and throwing each other into this competitive market, we should have a more cooperative, kind of egalitarian society, a more democratic society, where we see each other as equals, and we actually are kind of equals in fact.
Sure. So I want to take us to the more sort of controversial question, which is about Eugene Debs and race. A lot of people look at Debs and point out the fact that he was absolutely opposed to de jure segregation. He refused to speak before segregated audiences, not offices. He refused segregated locals in the party, and was very much against this sort of de jure racism. And many people have pointed at to say, Debs had a very progressive, very forward-thinking position on race and racism. But other people have sort of latched on to this quote that Debs said about the Socialist Party platform: "We have nothing special to offer to Black workers," basically. And some people have felt like he had a limited understanding of the question of racism. I know Bill Fletcher, who's a longtime DSA member and has presented at this night school on socialism and anti-racist struggle, has sort of criticized Debs' remarks, and while he is supportive of Sanders, suggested that Sanders doesn't have as strong as a view of race as he could, because he takes this sort of Debsian approach. Obviously, this is a source of debate. People feel very, very diametrically opposed on this one, and I'm not endorsing either view. So how does the Socialist Party handle the question of race, and how would you assess Debs' views on this?
Well, I mean, you can't really understand Debs' views without making reference to the party's views. I mean, in many cases, the party is ranges from quite bad to abominable on questions of race and racism. Certainly, when it comes to Black workers, but even perhaps surprisingly for some today, it's they're even worse when it comes to Asian workers. The real
Much of the labor movement, including, I believe, the Knights of Labor, the radical wing of it, supported the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah, and certainly the mainstream of the labor movement supported that for a long time. Supported excluding Asian immigrants from the country. So yeah, I think I find it a little difficult because I think when we look back at history, there's both the two sort of impulses that I think aren't particularly helpful are a kind of hagiographic impulse that Debs was some sort of saint, or anyone that we might find admirable in history was a saint. And then the other impulse, which is like, we need to problematize these.
Yeah.
we have to problematize these figures, and we have to say that these were they weren't so good for their for the kind of standards that we would set today, or something like that. And I don't know. I think Debs is actually a pretty example of that, because I don't know. It's.
I mean, many people feel that way. Many people feel that Debs is an exemplary figure in his opposition to racism. I'm not asserting that the other point of view is correct. I'm just acknowledging that this is a polarizing
It
topic.
is. It
in the
is.
Debs
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. I think the best piece to read on this is actually something that we republished a while ago. It's called Something to Offer, which is obviously a play on the quote that you mentioned. It's by this historian of labor politics and Black politics, William Jones. And, actually, I'll put it in the chat, I
Yeah,
guess.
I remember when it was published.
Because that, I think that is a very comprehensive look. It's, it's like 5,000 or 6,000 words just on this question. And I think is quite persuasive in arguing that Debs was quite good on this. I think so. I think the more fair argument that you can make is that Debs didn't make it enough of a priority to organize within the party, to sort of root out the racism in the party, or push the party to just take a stronger anti-racist stance and kind of foreground it as a basic question of especially this is the first couple of decades of the 20th century when the Debs party is going on. So this is obviously the rise of Jim Crow too, and this is a real this is just a shot at the heart of any kind of democracy that you might want to have. I mean, this is a central question of democracy at the time. It is opposing Jim Crow and opposing the kind of subordination, the racial subordination of Black people. And so I think you can argue that like Debs should have made it more of a point to organize around that. At the same time, you could also say that you also have to remember that Debs, while his positions were very well known, he often kind of hovered above the fray on internal party questions, and he was the person that kind of unified the party and went out and kind of tirelessly gave speeches for the socialist cause. He wasn't one that was kind of fighting factional fights on behalf of the left of the party. And again, you can fault him for that. And certainly I think people have, and you can make that argument. I think that's a fair argument. I don't think it's fair that he, it was a class reductionist, or that he like didn't actually understand the kind of ways that Black people were subjected to horrific forms of white supremacy. I mean, I could just start reading quotes. I could just start reading
Not
quotes.
on trial here, Sean.
I know, but it's just I don't take that view that seriously. The quote unquote like class reductionist view. But like I said, I do think it's fair. It's fair if you want to, if you find it compelling, I guess, to fault him for not organizing around it more in the party.
Yeah, and on both those things, this is something that people long after he's dead are deciding what he should or should not have done. I definitely know some of the small left sects that used to dominate what existed as a socialist movement in this country prior to 2016 would spend a lot of time getting very angry that Eugene Debs didn't organize on behalf of the left wing of the party, and it caused the collapse of everything. And this issue from 100 years ago is what you need to tell striking workers about now.
It's also worth noting that he got like many other issues. I mean, Debs's life is basically just like the story of him getting more and more radical as the years went on. Like the day he died, he was more radical than he ever was. And so that's true for questions of racism too. So during the Pullman strike, he actually tried to get a motion passed to include Black workers in the strike, and then once it failed, he kind of he referenced it in many, like many speeches after. Like this was one of the reasons that the Pullman strike failed. And then he got, progressively more vocal about the kind of depravities, really, of white supremacy and the horrors of racism in the U.S. So especially in the 19 teens, he's writing a lot more about horrors of lynching and the way the criminal justice system is throwing Black people in jail, and then he's actually a prison abolitionist by the end of his life too. So that, I guess those are my general thoughts on it. But again, I think he could have organized within the party more, but he also was quite good compared to, I don't know, 99.9% of it. Well, so, yeah, within the party, but even in the broader society,
yes.
He took a much more kind of militantly anti-racist view than 99% of the country. So
yeah. So how does internationalism play into Debs's politics? Is he an internationalist?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's partly. I mean, so I'm in the early stages of writing my book, and I think that's one of the key things I want to research more, I guess, to get a better sense of how he came to become an internationalist, I guess, because I think he absolutely was. And I think you can tell the story that, and I think I tried to make this argument in the long piece I wrote late last year on Debs for Jacobin, that basically he was just sort of extending the principles that he took seriously in the domestic sphere to the international sphere. So, if you think that we need to challenge these hierarchies within the workplace and in the broader society, then we also need to challenge them across borders too. If class struggle is the way that you do that in the domestic sphere, it's also in the international sphere. So workers of the world have to unite, and war and kind of militarism is a way that is a kind of outgrowth of capitalist competition, and the only people that are benefiting from this war are capitalists of various countries, and so workers in the U.S. have more in common with workers, say in Germany during World War I, or workers have more in common than they're sensible foes and on the other side of the battlefield than they do with their own sort of dominant capitalist class at home.
Which I think brings us perhaps to the most dramatic, maybe not as dramatic as the Pullman strike, but one of the most dramatic episodes in Debs's political career, which is what happens during World War I. How did the Socialist Party orient itself to World War I, and how did Debs react to this? What role did he play?
Yeah, so unlike most of the other socialist parties in the European world, they opposed the war from the beginning, and they suffered for it. They faced an extraordinary amount of repression. There was both before, to some extent before the U.S. entered the war, but especially after the U.S. entered the war in 1917. That's when really the kind of hammer of government and vigilante repression came down on them. So socialist papers were, basically shuttered. Their mailing privileges were revoked, and there were vigilantes that would, beat up socialists and ransack socialist offices, and then socialist leaders started getting jailed too for their opposition to the war. So Kate Richards O'Hare was a prominent one. She was kind of Midwestern socialist, very popular on the speaking circuit. She was jailed in, I think, early 1917, if I remember right. She was jailed sometime in 1917. She was jailed before Debs. So Debs was jailed after he gave his famous speech in Canton, Ohio, in the summer of 1918. And he was, quite aware that he was risking his safety, I guess, at that point. But he, like the rest of the party, he didn't really back down.
So I mean that is a matter of contention amongst Debs biographers about what he was intending to do that day in Canton, and I don't know the answer, but I know some people feel very much like he went on stage that day with the intent to I don't want to say make a martyr of himself, because that has such a negative connotation, where there are other historians and Debs scholars who think that Debs actually chose his words quite carefully in the Canton speech to avoid bringing down any sort of prosecution. And it was a journalist who led to Debs being prosecuted. I'm blanking on the name of the gentleman, but he basically, in addition to being a journalist, played the role of a snitch by calling up the U.S. Attorney's Office and telling them the horrible things Debs had just said, and goading them into prosecuting him, basically. So there is the great role of journalism in our democracy at work. So what do you think? What do you think Debs's intent was in giving this speech? And could you tell us some of the things that he said during it?
Yeah, I mean, so the speech is quite long, but it's very good. I think we republished it a few years ago, and it's something like 9,000 words or something, if you actually read the whole transcript. But he talks some about the war, but he also it is partly just a kind of standard Debs stump speech where he's like, kind of singing the praises of socialism and, telling workers that they need to unite and throw off their shackles. But he does talk about the war. He doesn't, I don't know. I mean, I think he chose his words carefully to some extent. This wasn't the first anti-war speech that he'd given that summer. So I think the question of whether he was trying to, I don't know. I don't think he was trying to provoke, but I also think it's, to some extent, it's beside the point. I think he was giving an anti-war address to some extent, and sort of knew in his mind that was gonna that the law was going to catch up with him. Basically, he was, like I said, he wasn't the first one that was jailed in the party, so he knew that this was, and he was the most prominent one in the party too. So he knew the kind of consequences that he might be facing.
I believe much of the Ohio leadership had been jailed, and jail is literally, I've heard, this might just be mythology, it's literally across the way from where the Canton picnic is happening. So
yeah, he visited the socialist leaders in prison before he gave the speech that day.
And the quote that gets him in trouble is that the master class has always declared the wars, the subject class has always fought the battles. If war is right, let it be declared by the people. You have your lives to lose. You certainly, above all others, have the right to decide this momentous issue of war or peace. Then Clyde Miller of the Cleveland Plain Dealer is the journalist who does his journalistic duty in helping the state suppress freedom of speech. And then he is indicted under the Espionage Act, and he goes to jail. You mentioned other socialist leaders were convicted under this. I would be remiss if I did not mention the story of Victor Berger, who is indicted or charged. He's indicted, I believe, convicted under the Espionage Act, and he runs for Congress on an anti-war, pro-free speech platform. He's elected. Congress refuses to seat him on the grounds that he has been indicted under the Espionage Act. They have a special election. He wins the special election, and then Congress again refuses to seat him, and they don't call another special election. Essentially, the people of his district have forfeited their right to have a democracy by voting for the wrong person. And this is because he opposed a war that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. And similarly in the New York State legislature, you see them refusing to seat members of the Socialist Party. So yeah, some war to make the world safe for democracy. It's interesting. It's interesting, Sean, as sort of a general observation. Whenever we go to war in this country for democracy abroad, we very quickly lose it at home.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most interesting parts of that speech, I think, is the way that Debs sort of twists that or throws that rhetoric back on the kind of war's defenders, the kind of making the world safe for democracy, and makes that same point. And he says that the German socialists are, they've suffered for many years under oppression autocracy, and they're the ones that are defending democracy in their country. And we have we have the German despots, the Junkers, we have the Wall Street despots in America. So he tries to make this kind of connection between different ruling classes and in different parts of the world, and then tries to make this argument that this is the kind of idea that this is a war for democracy is a farce.
Yeah, and talk about Debs's running for president from prison.
Yeah, so he ends up in prison. His actually one of the most famous addresses he gives right before he's sentenced, or maybe it's right after he's sentenced, his statement to the court. And then he ends up in prison, and he doesn't really want to run again, but he is the most popular socialist in the country, and he also there's also this kind of symbolic weight to a run. He's running from prison, and the Socialist Party makes it a referendum on civil liberties, and Debs sends a kind of weekly address and hopes that the newspapers around the country will print it. But basically, his campaign is limited to that. He doesn't really have a whole lot of kind of access to the media or way to get his message out there. But they tried to make it about the need to stand up for civil liberties and democratic rights, and we need to vote for Debs. So we need to vote for Debs to sort of show that we oppose this abridgment of civil liberties, and we need to free him, and we need to free all the other political prisoners in the country too. So it's a pretty remarkable campaign. He ends up winning about a million votes.
So I'm going to open up to audience questions in just a minute, but why should Eugene Debs matter to today's socialist, Sean?
I think his vision of kind of foregrounding the fight for democracy is one that we should take up, both on the kind of a substantive basis, that this is like the kind of way that we should think about the struggles that we're in. And then also, I think on a rhetorical level, it's quite effective too, to sort of make our case in terms of talking about democracy and freedom. So that's one thing. I would also say his sort of focus on class struggle is really key too, and the kind of central role that workers play in the socialist have to play in the socialist movement, and have to play in any kind of kind of movement for democracy in the country. And then finally is internationalism. I think is super important too, and it's something that I think I think everyone, I think everyone in DSA and every kind of progressive really has kind of, at the very least, sort of like vague kind of internationalist ideals. But I think it's important, especially, as Biden kind of tries to ratchet up tensions with China, and as there's there's some, you could argue that there's some progress in the domestic sphere under Biden, but it's certainly obviously we would make critiques from the left on domestic policy, but in the international sphere, I mean, we're living in a global empire, and we have to see it as central to socialist politics to really fight to dismantle that.
That is an excellent answer, Sean. So if people have questions, could they please put them in the chat box? And I'd like to see, questions. So someone wants to know about Debs's position on the IWW.
Okay, 1 second. I just need to plug my computer in. I'm about to die.
Of course. All right, we're waiting for Sean to return.
Sorry about that.
And if anyone else has questions, could they please put them in the chat box?
Okay, so you said Debs in the IWW?
Yeah.
Okay. So Debs helped found the IWW, 1905, I believe, 1906. And in some ways, the IWW is sort of an extension of this kind of industrial unionism in the American Railway Union, and the kind of unionism that he had been promoting before joining the Socialist Party. But also, it's quite a bit more radical than the ARU was. He sort of had a complicated relationship with the IWW, because he certainly, the basic ideals of it, an injury to one is an injury to all. He believed that to his core, and believed that was like the only effective form of labor politics too. But he ended up leaving the IWW not too long after it formed, because he was sort of worried that it wasn't as concerned with political action, and that it had this kind of syndicalist politics that eschewed any sort of political action. And he certainly had a different idea about what electoral politics should look like for the Socialist Party than someone like Victor Berger. He still thought that political action was really important. So that was like the big kind of difference that he had. Obviously, when it came to the kind of goal of a goal of a one big union, or a goal of an industrial union that organized workers across lines of craft and race and gender, Debs was all for that. But like I said, the political action was sort of a hang up that he had.
So so let's so one thing I meant to return to earlier, and someone else has asked about, is you mentioned that Debs developed a sort of abolitionist politics. I believe the only book Debs wrote in his lifetime was about prison. Could you talk a little bit about how Debs came to these views and what precisely they were?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was being in prison.
Yes.
That was
prison tends to radicalize people, as I said earlier.
Yeah. So he wrote that. It's a book called Walls and Bars, and like you said, it's the only book that he wrote. It actually came out the year after he died in 1927. But it's basically a series. It's a kind of collection of a series of articles that he wrote in think it was 1922, maybe 23, that were circulated about like his experience in prison and his views on prisons. And so the book was published posthumously in 1927. But yeah, he again, I guess I'll come back to the question of the kind of question of democracy. I mean, he sort of saw prison in those terms, and there's this really amazing quote. I actually wrote it down because I did want to mention it. Let me find it. It sums up his views on prison quite well. So he says, this is in Walls and Bars. He says, on the outside of the prison walls, the wage slave begs his master for a job. On the inside, he cowers before the club of his keeper. The entire process is a degenerating one and robs a human being either as a wage slave walking the street or as a convict crouching in the cell of every attribute of sovereignty and every quality that dignifies his nature. So, so yeah, that's Debs on prison. It's interesting because he did. So I guess I'd say two other things about his experience in prison. He actually befriends basically all of the wardens that he is that is sort of that are keeping him in captivity. And you know, this is partly just like Debs as a human being. He was by all accounts something of just an extraordinarily like decent, humane person, and even to his prison wardens. He also just showed an enormous amount of like he viewed his fellow prisoners as equals, and he treated them with dignity, and helped them with writing letters and offered them advice and gave them lots of gifts and stuff that he would receive. And they absolutely loved him. Like there's only one video of Debs that we have, and it doesn't have any sound, but you can look it up on YouTube. And
it's him walking out of the prison?
Yeah, exactly. It's only like 25, 30 seconds. And you can see him like turn around and sort of gesture to the prison. And that's like when the prisoners were like cheering him when he was leaving. So yeah, he was certainly shaped by his time in prison and sort of saw it as a kind of institution in capitalist society that had to go, and saw it as just like a way for it. Basically, he saw prison as a way for society to like throw away the poor and the destitute that they had robbed of their dignity in the workplace and in like capitalist society. So
I mean, and while Debs is in prison, there is a Free Debs movement, along with sort of a general amnesty movement for opponents of the war. And there's sort of a debate within it about whether you pardon everyone or just some people. And early on, Debs is quite opposed to the idea that he would get a pardon when the other war resistors would not. And it takes a lot of convincing and cajoling to get him to accept the pardon. And he also, I believe, visits Warren G. Harding in the White House as part of. They let him go to Washington on a train unsupervised.
Really wild, yeah.
Yeah, they let him leave the prison, get on a train, and go chat with the president about whether or not he should be pardoned. And I believe there's a story that when they finally give him the pardon and he's walking out the White House, I don't think it's Harding, maybe his chief of staff or attorney general says, what are you going to do now? And he goes, I'm going to work for everyone in prison to be free. And he goes, well, please find something more productive to do, is what they ask him. but I don't think he did. So was universal health care something that was being talked about in Debs's day? This is a question from Alex.
That's a good question. Not really outside of, I mean, it probably, it probably showed up on like a list of, socialist demands. We need this, a variety of public services that will, support the kind of material well-being of the working class. But it wasn't, and certainly there were municipal governments, I'm fairly sure that certainly improved healthcare and probably extended healthcare services to workers, but not really.
Any other questions would people like to ask in the chat box? Well, I guess so. The Socialist Party, near the end of Debs's life, it splinters into three parties: the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and the Communist Labor Party. And that's not sort of the first split the party has, right? Big Bill Haywood is thrown out at one point. Could you talk about some of the sort of splits and ruptures in the party?
Yeah, well, like you said, the big one was after the Russian Revolution. I'm actually surprised no one asked about Debs' view about the Russian Revolution.
He is a Bolshevik from his head to his toe.
That's he was. Yes, it's true. He was rather critical of the Russian Revolution too, as David is noting. He did sour on the USSR.
Okay, David.
It's true. It is true. It is true. He did. Or he was. I mean, he was. He opposed the that some of the executions that occurred
in the Telegram,
right, and he also opposed some of the attacks on civil liberties too, but he certainly doesn't take as hard of line on the Soviet Union in his life as certainly some of the socialists do.
He doesn't really live long enough.
No.
Do that, right? The ones who took hard lines, like Norman Thomas, during this period, they weren't taking such a hard line. I feel like that comes later.
Well, there were definitely say like kind of moderate New York socialists in the 1920s that were pretty anti-Soviet Union. And he didn't necessarily, I mean, he definitely was, he didn't have particularly good dealings with like individual communists, even though they were former comrades. He did sort of start to view them a little suspiciously. And, the Communist Party in the 1920s was not the most, it wasn't, the most ecumenical of parties, and it did, it did try to, certainly was engaged in lots of attempts to take down the Socialist Party to varying degrees. So
yeah, I believe early on all of the parties tried very hard to recruit Debs, and he ended up staying the Socialist. And I do know he got into it with one of the communists. I want to say it was William Z. Foster. In a fight over the party's decision to endorse Robert La Follette in 1924. Because I think early on the communists had toyed with the idea of doing so, and then they got orders from Moscow not to, and then they attacked the Socialist Party for doing so, and Debs wrote a very spicy letter.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that's worth mentioning on this is that Debs really opposed the idea that like the Comintern should be able to order parties in varying countries to do what they wanted to do. Like he thought that was he has some line, I can't remember year this was, but some line about like rejecting a pope from on high or something like that. And that was the kind of idea that like he wanted democratic decision making within the individual kind of national parties, and he certainly wasn't opposed to an internationalist grouping, but he thought that it was too top down, basically.
Yeah, David keeps asking where Debs's family was from. I know you answered that earlier, but
Yeah, they're from France.
France.
And
His middle name Victor is after Victor Hugo, right?
right, and the first one is after Eugene Sue,
I have no idea who that is.
who's like a French novelist. So they were both French novelists. Yeah, his parents were both from France.
And then David wants you to talk about Debs's brother. He would encourage you to mention that.
Yeah, sure, I can do that, David.
He's being very, very demanding. We both know David. So that's why we're giving him a hard time.
I actually wrote a post about Theodore Debs, his brother, a few weeks ago. And David is again mentioning that. So you can read that. But yeah, he was a really crucial part of Debs's life. He was younger. He was 9 years younger than Debs, and basically from, I guess he helped Debs like to some extent in his union days, but especially through his Socialist Party years, he was just like absolutely central as Debs' secretary, and just like providing emotional support and just being like the behind the scenes person that like, always had his brother's back. He like Debs like could not have accomplished what he did without his brother. And so he's the kind of behind the scenes person, I guess, that, I think it's worth remembering, that we have there. It's worth remembering to humanize Debs, and also to sort of stress that, even the greats like Eugene Debs need like an enormous amount of support.
Ingrid would like to know about his wife.
Yeah, I was going to talk about his wife now too. Yeah, so his wife is Kate Debs. They got married in 1885. And there's very different accounts, I guess you could say, of Kate Debs. Both of the biographies, and really basically all of the biographies, do not portray her particularly well. Some are more charitable than others, I would say, but they basically depict her as kind of status obsessed and not not really holding the socialist values that her husband did, and kind of distant and cold. But there's a historian that's at the Debs Foundation that wrote a paper a couple years ago, and I think she might be doing more work on Kate Debs. Actually, I know she is doing more work on Kate Debs. And she takes a very different view, and it makes the argument that he was that these past biographers were quite wrong, and that she did provide lots of emotional support, and also was like a socialist in her own right, and kind of goes through her family background, and tries to make this argument that she was like a comrade of Debs, essentially. So it's a very different. To be honest, I won't be able to give you a definitive answer until I kind of look into it more. But those are the kind of two views that have been advanced among historians.
And there was another woman as well.
Oh,
you didn't? Oh, okay, never mind. I didn't know I was giving.
No, Yeah, well, it's true. He had a. We also don't know too much about her, but yeah, he had a secret lover, I guess you could say. Although it's not even clear. I haven't seen anything that suggests that they actually consummated that affair. But they were Yeah, Debs met her on the 1916 congressional run in Indiana, and her name was Mabel Curry. And yeah, I mean, Debs is clearly in love with her. If you read the letters, they're like quite rapturous. Um, Read the letters from him to her, and vice versa. Um, and it is quite a departure from his letters to his wife, which are definitely like loving, but they're more like kind of staid and not particularly emotive. So we can say that, like, by the end of his life, he was not in a passionate marriage, but and then there was also this other woman that he was involved with.
So does anyone have any other questions for us this evening? If not, I think we're gonna liberate Sean. And then Dave, do we have any announcements tonight, or are we announcement free?
I think the only announcement we have is that if people are interested in getting involved in political education work in the chapter, that they can come to our meeting, which I'm going to put the link in for. This is, if you are a member of our chapter, we encourage you and you want to be a part and support our political education work, come out and be a part of that discussion. But we don't have anything else on the books yet, although we hope we will have some new night schools coming up soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you everyone for attending. That's it for the evening.
Yeah, thanks, Chip. Thanks, everyone.
And the recording of this will be on our website and hopefully our YouTube too.
Sounds good. All right. Good night.
Thank you.